Good evening, everyone. We are going to get started right on time because we have a live stream audience tonight, so folks sitting in front of their computers waiting for us to start. So welcome to our live stream viewers. My name is Carol Ann McGregor. I serve as Vice President Academic and Dean here at St. Jerome's University, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Lectures in Catholic Experience, whether you're here in Notre Dame Chapel or watching live online. As is our custom, we'll start with a territorial acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect that St. Jerome's University and the University of Waterloo reside and operate on the traditional territory of the Attawadran, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Our university is situated on the Haldeman Tract, the land granted to the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations of the Grand River in 1784 that includes 10 kilometers on both sides of the Grand River and extends to its source at Lake Erie. We give thanks for the privilege to work and live on this land, and we are committed to building respectful relationships with Indigenous people and communities to enhance our knowledge and learn how we can have an active role in reconciliation. So I'd like to begin by just giving you a brief history of the Lectures in Catholic Experience. I see many faces in the crowd tonight who have come to these lectures before, many of you since the very beginning, but for those of you who are attending your first Lectures in Catholic Experience, we've been doing these here at the university since 1982. We offer them to our local community, providing opportunities for us to engage with the critical issues of our time. We've invited scholars, activists, experts, and religious leaders to address subjects including religion and politics, spirituality, ecological responsibility, religious pluralism, ecumenism, interfaith dialogue, and religion in the media, among many other topics. The theme for this year's lectures is solidarity in the time of solitudes. You'll see a card if you're here in person on your chair with all of the lectures in the series. We're bringing together a series of talks by academics and practitioners who will help us understand the potential for solidarity in a time of solitudes. Our speakers this year will challenge us to think about the religion of the heart that may not appear in the church pew, remind us of the potential for sport to bridge difference, surprise us with the potential of interfaith dialogue on university campuses, inform our understanding of religion and political polarization, and speak to the past, present, and future of a synodal church, all the while emphasizing our collective obligation to people on the margins. With that, I'll turn to giving a little bit of context to this evening's talk and our speaker. The talk is titled The Spiritual Turn and the Challenge of Solidarity and is offered by Dr. Galen Watts. Galen is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Waterloo and associate director of the new Institute for Religion, Culture, and Societal Futures that is housed here at St. Jerome's. He earned his PhD in Cultural Studies at Queen's University and held postdoctoral positions at the Center for Sociological Research at KU Leuven in Belgium. He continues to serve as a research associate in the research cluster on comparative inequality and inclusion at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard and is an affiliated scholar of the Institute for Advanced Catholic Studies at the University of Southern California. His research focuses on cultural and institutional change in liberal democracies since the 1960s, with a focus on the spheres of religion, morality, work, and politics. His first book, The Spiritual Turn, The Religion of the Heart and the Making of Romantic Liberal Modernity, was published in 2022 by Oxford University Press and won the 2023 Society for the Scientific Study of Religion's Distinguished Book Award. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Galen Watts.
So I think, can everyone hear me? Is the mic on? Testing. There we are. So I'm going to stand here. Those of you who have been in my classes know I like to pace a little bit as I speak, and I feel a little bit more intimate when I'm standing here. So let me begin just by offering a heartfelt thanks to Carol Ann and Peter and St. Jerome's. I'm really honored and excited to be here. So what I want to do over the next 45 to 50 minutes is tell a story. The story I want to tell, I should say, is not specific to Catholics or Catholicism. It's not even specific to Christians, Christianity, or even those who are religious. I want to suggest that the story I'm going to tell is really about Canada or Canadians in the 21st century. And if you don't mind me being a bit melodramatic, about the modern world, the world today. Specifically the world as we know it, in the wake of the 1960s. So I'm going to do something, though, slightly counterintuitive, and that's I want to tell the story of our world today by focusing on religion, thinking about how religion has changed over the past 50, 60 years. Because I think that we can think about religion as a kind of microcosm of what's been taking place in the wider society, right? I think that looking at religion and the changes taking place in the religious sphere is illuminating. It tells us something about our situation and about ourselves. The other thing I want to do is I want to tell a story that avoids as much as possible what I'll call the kind of one-dimensional character of a lot of the stories that you hear today about the world. And as I see it, there's really kind of two genres of story. On one hand, the story that we hear is a story of progress, a story of triumph, right? Of increasing prosperity, increasing freedom and equality, especially for minority groups, right? Women, LGBTQ folk, right? Ethnic and religious minorities. It is a story fundamentally of progress. Now, you hear on the other side, right, the opposite story, a story of decline, right? A story of stagnation, of the fraying of social bonds, of eroding communities and commitments, right? This is really a story of despair. And I want to suggest that on their own, both of these stories are wrong, right? But that they contain partial truths. And so the story I want to tell, in some sense, is going to try and hold both of these truths together, right? Because if we can do that, I think we'll have a much better sense of where we are and a much better chance of moving forward, okay? So I've said then that I want to focus on religion, think about the world today through the lens of religion. So let's look then at what has been happening in religion, right? Now, it probably isn't a surprise to most of us here that one of the dominant stories in the religious sphere has been one of institutional decline. So across, what sociologists like to call the 3 Bs, believing, belonging, and behavior, we have seen marked decline, right? Canadians identify less as religious than they used to. They attend religious services less than they used to, right? And so as a result, if you do attend a congregation, right, scenes like this are probably very familiar to you. Now, that isn't to say that all churches, right, are empty, right? There are various, we have immigration, as we were talking over dinner, right, stemming the tide. And there are, of course, some forms of Christianity that have been doing okay, right, that have been even flourishing in some cases. And I'll get to that in just a sec. But I think really, when we think about religion, one way of thinking about it is that given the historic role of Christianity in countries like Canada, right, it has really been a story not just of the decline of institutional religion, but really of the institutional churches, right? That is a dominant story in Canadian life over the past 50 years. Now, if that was the only story worth telling, then I would just leave right now. But I think that there has been something else happening that's worthy of our attention. This is the thing that I've been thinking about for the past 10 years or so. So we can see this, for one, in the way that Canadians self-identify, right? So increasingly, Canadians think of themselves as spiritual but not religious, right? They're embracing spirituality, right? And we see this happening in quite large numbers. Some estimates suggest that as high as 40% of Canadians now identify in this way. And we're seeing similar kinds of trends happen in the US. Now, if it was just the way that Canadians identify, that wouldn't be all that important. But of course, we've seen other changes taking place on the ground, right? We've seen ancient Eastern practices like Buddhist meditation become extremely mainstream, right? Celebrities are now trumpeting its benefits. Similarly with yoga, right? An old ancient Hindu practice. These spiritual practices have increasingly gone mainstream. We've also seen, anybody who's been in an Indigo recently have probably noticed the rise of this sort of, spiritual but not religious book genre, right? That increasingly we see this kind of thing, and it's very popular, right? So popular that we're now writing children's books, right? So these have been happening at the same time. You've had the decline of the institutional churches, and yet you've also had this shift, this rise in people identifying as spiritual in all of these spiritual practices, right? And so naturally, sociologists have been wondering, well, how do we make sense of this? And when I first started engaging with this thought, what sociologists were saying is that, look, we've talked to people who are spiritual but not religious, and they give us 1,001 different definitions, right? There are as many definitions of spirituality as there are people, right? And so what the consensus in the academic literature was that we have no idea what's going on here. This is completely messy, right? This is completely incoherent, right? There is no kind of shared set of ideas or beliefs from one person to the next. Moreover, right, if you look at people who are spiritual but not religious, they pick and mix. They bring together things that are seemingly incoherent. They mix some mindfulness meditation with some Reiki, with some astrology, with some self-help. None of this makes any sense, right? There's no underlying coherence or logic to this, right? This was the consensus 10 years ago. And I'll say that much of my work, right, over the past decade has been trying to make the argument that that's wrong, right? So across a solo-authored book and then a recently published co-edited book, I've tried to make the argument, right, that actually when you hear talk of spirituality, what we need to see is that there is under this actually a very old religious tradition. And often the people who are spiritual but not religious don't know that they themselves belong to this tradition, right? That's the sort of paradox. It's a tradition that people don't actually know exists, but it is one, right? And I also have tried to make the argument that the rise of this tradition in the modern world, in the 21st century, is not a coincidence, but has very intimate ties with the wider changes in our society, specifically changes in our moral views and in our political views, right? That we need to view what happens in the religious sphere as intimately tied and bound up with what's happening outside of the religious sphere. So I should say that this is an argument that I'm not making just willy-nilly. I didn't just sort of make this up. That is, so one very important sort of source for me have been these historians of religion who have over the years been trying to bring attention to this tradition that exists, but is for many different reasons been kind of marginalized in the official histories of the West. And the argument is that this tradition goes as far back as early Christianity, but really you don't see it kind of make a splash, you might say, until roundabout the 18th century, right? And I call this tradition, following the theologian Ted Campbell, the religion of the heart. So let me just say a little bit about this history, right? Won't leave you hanging. So I think that, as I said, this is a tradition that is as old as Christianity and arguably comes out of a certain kind of mystical strand within Christianity. And you can see it in some ways, parts of it bubbling up in early Methodism, Pietism, Quakerism. But where you really see it kind of blossom first is in the 18th century in the Romantic movement. That the Romantics, from Shelley, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Byron, they were deifying the natural world, right? They saw the natural world as the sort of source of the divine, and they prized the values of authenticity and self-expression, right? That's what we talk about the Romantics. That's what we think of, right? But really, this tradition gets picked up in other ways by other movements. A very important movement here was transcendentalism, what I think of as the most important movement nobody's ever heard of, right? A very important spokesperson of transcendentalism was the poet and philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, also the naturalist and civil rights activist Henry David Thoreau. And for those of you who like the recent remake of Little Women, the author of that book, Louisa May Alcott, grew up in a transcendentalist family. Right? Now you see this tradition also bubble up in other movements of the 19th century. New Thought is another very important one. This is a precursor to positive psychology and also prosperity theology, for better or worse. And a little bit more esoteric, right, was another movement, Theosophy, right? Now, one of the sort of pioneers of Theosophy was this Russian mystic, Elena Blavatsky, who was one of the first to articulate what Aldous Huxley would later call the perennial philosophy, the idea that at the core of all religious traditions is a single source, that we're all heading up the same mountain to the same summit, right? And so naturally, given that, Blavatsky and her collaborator, Henry Steele Olcott, were some of the first to try and synthesize Eastern and Western traditions, right? To try and bring these together. And Olcott, interestingly, was one of the first very well-known Westerners to convert to Buddhism. Right? Now, I've been telling you that these different movements are sort of different iterations of this underlying tradition, right, that goes a long, long way back. And so I'm sure you're wondering, well, what exactly is this tradition? How do we go about identifying it? Now, in the book, I have kind of 10 different facets, but we don't have that much time. And so I'm going to give you kind of 5 of its key tenets that I think in different ways these movements articulated and endorsed. So this is a religious tradition. And so naturally, and I'm going to use some kind of big academic terms, but I promise to explain them. Naturally, as a religion, right, there's going to be some conception of ontology. In other words, an account of what's the nature of God, what's the nature of divine reality, right? And here, for the religion of the heart, God is going to be understood as a kind of omnipresent force that is immanent in the world, right? That is accessible to human beings, right? Not radically transcendent. Second is there's going to be an epistemology, right? By which I mean an account of how it is that we come to know spiritual or religious truths, right? And here, right, for the religion of the heart, we come to know spiritual religious truth primarily through experience. It is an experiential epistemology. The classical sociologist Max Weber argued that what defines a religion is that it gives account of the existence of suffering. It gives us, in other words, a theodicy. And the religion of the heart does this, of course. Tells us that suffering exists because it is redemptive. It plays a redemptive purpose in our lives. Moreover, we find a soteriology, another big fancy word, an account of salvation. How is it that we're saved? The religion of the heart says we are saved, and what we need to dedicate our lives to is achieving authentic selfhood, to realize ourselves. And there are sacred values in this religion. The values of individual freedom and personal authenticity. So I want to take you through each of these at a little bit more depth. I did interviews with Canadians who identify as spiritual but not religious, and I did field work at a number of different places, including a charismatic Christian church. And through all of this, I came to sort of see these underlying similarities. So in terms of ontology, how it is that God or the divine is understood. And I should say that espionars or people who adhere to the religion of the heart disagree a lot on the labels, right? That the term God may not be used by everyone. For others, it might be cosmic energy. For others, it might be the universe, right? But whatever we call it, it is considered immanent. It is very much in this world, right? And so it's very much, not something that is fundamentally otherworldly, of the kind that, say, the Calvinists, right, worshipped. This God, this divine, is accessible to human beings, right? And it permeates the material world. It shows up in our lives, right? And crucially, the reason for this is because we can experience it, right? We are able to experience the divine, right? And naturally, just before this, so these are some examples from my interviews, right, with Canadians. So some of them say that God is inside and outside of me, right? God is immanent in the world. All things are connected, right? Spirituality is like being aware of one's spirit and its connection to all things, capturing this shift towards an immanent conception of the divine. Now, as I said, you can access it, right? And so that means that it is primarily through experience that you come to know this divine, that you come to know this cosmic force, right? And this contrasts with, say, two other ways of coming to know, right? One might be through doctrine. You know what's true because you read it in a sacred text, because it says so, right? Or the other might be reason. You know because you have reflected, right? You've used methods of science or rational reflection to come to it. Here, it is experience, right? You know because you felt it, right? And moreover, the more intense, the more flow-like, the more effervescent the experience, the more meaningful and authoritative it is. That is how you know God or the divine. The theodicy. As I said, for Weber, religion gives us an explanation for the existence of suffering. It tells us why evil exists in the world. And for the religion of the heart, the explanation draws from what the narrative psychologist Dan McAdams calls this idea of the redemptive self. That fundamentally we suffer because suffering is redemptive. In what way is it redemptive? Right? It is redemptive because it helps us to become who we are meant to be. Right? We have to go through the hardships in our lives, otherwise we would not realize our true selves. Right? So suffering in our lives plays this very important role. Right? It is what allows us to redeem ourselves, allows us to realize who we are meant to be. And naturally this leads into its soteriology, right? That we fundamentally are on a quest to become who we truly are, right? We are trying to actualize our potential and we're trying to realize our true selves. That's why we're here, right? And we have to go through suffering and hardship and difficulties to do that. Now, as you can imagine, right, there are sacred values here at play. And the crucial ones for the religion of the heart are individual freedom, right? That how can you realize your true self if you're not free, right? If people or laws or institutions are constraining you, forcing you to be something that you're not, forcing you to stay where you are, right? To not go where your heart leads you, right? And of course, personal authenticity is an imperative, right? And so you need to be free to pursue your quest for authenticity, right? It would be a horrible society that didn't allow people to be who they truly are, right? And so it's for this reason I've come to think that spiritual but not religious people reject what they call religion, right? It's in the moniker that I'm spiritual but not religious. And I've asked people, well, what do you mean when you say I'm not religious? What is the religion that you're rejecting? And it's basically this, that religion is judgmental, it is oppressive, it's conformist, and it stifles me from being who I really am. In other words, I don't want it because it makes me unfree and it stops me from being authentic. Right? So these are the sacred values of contemporary spirituality. And I've told you so far that this tradition is very old and it has deep roots in the West, right? But of course it was quite marginal, right? Even throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, it was really confined to a bunch of quacks. But that changes in the 20th century, right? And I want to suggest that it's really because of three movements, what we would call in sociology carrier movements, that come to sort of pick this up and popularize it. The first is the New Age movement, right? Now, I often think there's sort of a great paradox about the New Age movement because nobody calls themselves New Age today. It is very uncool, right? And yet, in a sense, you know, the New Age was premised on this prophecy, right? That at some point we would realize a New Age and everyone would sort of live according to New Age values. Well, on some level, the prophecy came true, but we just don't recognize it, right? That in many respects, ideas that were championed in the New Age movement have become our common sense, right? Our cultural common sense. right? And they're not confined to fringes or quacks, right? Now, the New Age was not the only movement to carry forward the religion of the heart. There was another. The New Age movement was really a kind of grounds, a kind of grassroots civil society development. But alongside it was a more academic movement, which really happened in universities and particularly on the West Coast, which is probably not surprising. Two very important figures in this. The first, Abraham Maslow, right? Very important human potential thinker, humanistic psychologist. Most of us probably know Maslow to the extent that we do because he popularized our famous hierarchy of needs. So let's think about that, right? He says that all humans have a hierarchy of needs, right? Once our baser needs for safety and security are met, well, we go up to climb to the next higher needs. What is the very highest need? Self-actualization, right? That is the purpose of being human, right? That's the very highest quest that we could do. Right? The other was Carl Rogers, very important public intellectual and psychotherapist, well known for popularizing something called client-centered therapy, right? If you want to understand why therapy is so common and the kinds of therapeutic concepts that we now use, go back to Rogers, read him, right? So in his very famous book on becoming a person, he writes the following: "Experience is for me the highest authority. Neither the Bible nor the prophets, neither Freud nor research, neither the revelations of God nor man can take precedence over my own direct experience." Right? That's the religion of the heart, pure and simple. Right? But alongside the New Age and the human potential movement was a third movement. And this is going to seem a little bit strange for some of you, I suspect. And that's the charismatic Christian movement, which occurred in almost the same time. Right? And anybody who's been to an evangelical or charismatic Christian church will probably know that it has a distinctive worship style, right? And it is one of those few forms of religiosity, of Christianity, that has actually grown. It's done really well in recent years, right? Why is that? Well, the answer to that is answered in this fantastic book by the anthropologist Tanya Luhrmann from Stanford. And she looked at how the thing about charismatic Christianity is it makes God real. It's all about having this visceral experience of the Holy Spirit, right? You're immersed in God's love. You have this visceral feeling, right? And so she writes, mainstream churches have seen their congregations dwindle. Evangelical, New Age, and other more demanding faiths have seen their memberships explode. And what U.S. citizens seem to want from these new religiosities, and from evangelical Christianity in particular, is intense spiritual experience. Right? So charismatic Christianity has carried forward the religion of the heart in a Christian garb. And it's succeeded. It's done really well, right? And the reason for that is not a coincidence, because the problem is that we've tended to look at religion as though things are happening in a vacuum. But that's a mistake, right? Religion is equally affected by what's going on in the rest of society, right? Which is not to say that, it's just a kind of passive actor getting affected by the rest. It also has an effect in return. But this is, to use another academic term, it's a kind of dialectical relationship, right? They're feeding off each other. And so we need to think then about what happened in the wider society over this time. Well, first we have to think about what Michael Ignatieff calls the rights revolutions. This was, speaking of the very important movements for civil rights, of course for gender equality, for gay rights, ethnic and religious diversity rights. And the crucial thing I want to suggest is that in these different ways, these movements all championed the same sacred values of individual freedom and personal authenticity. And as we'll see, it's actually not surprising then that you'll see these interlinks between these political, moral movements and the spiritual movements, be it New Age, charismatic Christianity, or the human potential movement. Consider, for instance, second-wave feminism, right? One of the most important rights revolutions of the 20th century, right? Women fighting for freedom, for equality, right? The right to be able to work, to get paid equally, right? To not be discriminated against, right? Now, if we go back to one of the most important texts of this movement, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique. One of the things that Friedan argues is that the problem with patriarchy is that it fundamentally undermines women's ability to realize their true selves, to self-actualize, right? It undermines their ability to pursue who they really are, right? And not surprisingly, the famous activist Gloria Steinem would later, leave religion and increasingly move towards a more spiritual orientation, right? Any religion in which God looks suspiciously like the ruling class is very different from spirituality that honors the godliness in each of us, she writes. And this has been a very important trend, right? Many feminists left the churches, right, and adopted a more spiritual but not religious orientation. This has continued on, right? You see the late black feminist Bell Hooks doing something similar. Think also now of the gay liberation movements, right? The gay rights revolutions of this period, right? Where the fundamental message for many gay activists was accept us for who we are. Let us be our true selves. Let us love the people that we love, right? It was a message of authenticity, right? Why force us to repress what is truly us, right? And we've seen also a similar move, right, within the LGBT community to embrace a more spiritual but not religious orientation, right? Precisely because of these underlying shared values, these shared orientations. Think also of another very important movement of the late 20th century, the rise of modern environmentalism. Right? Now, one of the things about the environmental movement was that it challenged the view that many modern capitalist societies have of the natural world, which is that it's just dead matter to be extracted for our own purposes. Right? That for many environmentalists, that was the wrong way to think about the natural world. The natural world was, in some sense, alive, right? It had a certain kind of energy and life to it that needed to be protected and even revered, right? So the historian Doug Rossenow has written that what really happened was there was a kind of revival of that Emersonian ideal of a harmony between humans and the rest of nature and a belief in a spirit life that connected all things, right? There was a profoundly spiritual dimension to modern environmentalism. And so not surprisingly, you've seen the rise and spread of many kind of mixes of spirituality and environmentalism. Right? The two quite easily go together. Now lastly, and a little bit more relevant just to our home, Canada, multiculturalism. Right? Canada embraced multiculturalism as an official policy, right, in the 70s. And one of the experts on multiculturalism, my doctoral supervisor, Will Kimlicka, right, has made the argument that we need to understand the shift towards multiculturalism as a process of liberalization and democratization. Right? That fundamentally, actually, the move towards affirming people, allowing them to celebrate their home cultures, has actually been about allowing them to be more free, to recognize them, to allow them to be their authentic selves, right? So it was not fair, it was not right for us to force immigrants to conform to a very narrow model of what it meant to be Canadian, right? We need to broaden what a Canadian is. And multiculturalism has been a part of that project. And naturally, you can see how that would show up in religion, right? It will lead people to start thinking, well, what do we have in common, right? These different religious traditions, right? Is there a way for us to live together, right? Can we find a way to reconcile our differences, right? And spirituality, I think, has been an important outlet for that project. So, as you can probably guess, what I've been arguing is that we have to understand the spiritual turn, as I call it, the turn towards spirituality, as profoundly tied up with much wider social developments, moral and political, in our society. And so it's not surprising that it has become so popular, right? Because the world today, our country today, we prize individual freedom and personal authenticity, right? We take these as sacred values. Canadians increasingly, we raise up values of autonomy, self-expression and diversity, right? And difference. And so the spiritual turn is a part of that larger story. Now, here we can bring back those two stories I talked about at the beginning. Because I want to suggest that the spiritual turn has brought immense progress. It has made our world more free. Free particularly for minorities and women, right? We have a Charter of Rights. Let's not forget this happened over this period, right? But it's also, more free in the sense that people feel more comfortable in their skin, right? People can love who they love. People can marry who they marry, or they cannot marry at all, right? People have choice that they can pursue, right? They're not constrained. And we also have a world where, women, the other half, can actually have positions of authority and recognition, public recognition in our society, right? These, in my view, are all achievements worth celebrating. This is a story of progress, right? But at the same time, over the exact same period, I should also say, one of the things I think that's wonderful about Canada in the 21st century is, we have intermarriage, interfaith marriage, interracial marriage, right? That increasingly our children are going to be every different color, right? That's a wonderful thing, right? Something we should be proud of. But at the same time, we have to face the facts, because over that exact same period, we have also seen this. We have seen increased inequality, right? The haves and the have-nots are increasingly separated. We also increasingly live in echo chambers of our own making, right? We are in our own political bubbles, right? We see an epidemic of loneliness and mental illness, particularly among young people, right? Feelings of despair, of alienation, of feelings of meaninglessness, right? And not surprisingly then, we've seen a decline in social trust. People don't think that other people have good motives, right? And a decrease in public life, right? Of active engagement in public life. People don't join things anymore, right? They stay at home. And not surprisingly with all of this, we have institutional sclerosis and decline. A feeling like all of the institutions in our society just aren't working, right? There's just something wrong with them. Right? All of this has happened over the exact same period, right? So how do we make sense of this? Now, I cannot claim to have a panacea, and I certainly can't claim to have a master key. But I will say, one of the most important influences for me has been the French sociologist Émile Durkheim. And part of this is that Durkheim was able to hold this view about the modern world in his head, that on one level it promises more freedom and diversity and equality, but it always threatens, right, to go too far because, right, it can undermine the basis of solidarity and cohesion, right? And so on one level, right, we are a more free and prosperous society, which is not to say that everybody's free and prosperous, right? But as a society, by historical standards, we are. We are a more free and prosperous society than we've ever been. But we lack, I think, a profound sense of solidarity, right? And we can see this showing up across the different pathologies that I've identified, right? That inequality can be understood as a profound lack of solidarity between the rich and the poor. Right? That polarization is really the result of our unwillingness to engage with the other. The person who we don't like, who makes us uncomfortable, right? We're not even willing to try. We don't trust people and we don't want to spend time with each other. We feel less connected, and so we feel lonely, right? And because of all of this, we have so little sense of how much we're in this together, right? And so we don't think it's worth it to put the time in to engage in public life, right? We say, well, everybody's out for themselves, so maybe I should be too, right? And then naturally, we take our institutions for granted, and they decline. And we wonder why, right? So I'm not saying that our lack of solidarity is the only cause of all this, but it is a very important one, in my view. Now, what does all of this have to do with spirituality? Well, I want to go back again. I think that we can learn something very important about the wider society by thinking about religion. And so I want to try and think through these challenges and the lack of solidarity and look at spirituality as a kind of microcosm, right, of this wider societal problem. And the way that I've come to think about this is that we can think about spirituality today as really embodying 3 E's, right? Everyone loves typology with the same letter. On some level, I think that both contemporary spirituality, but also mainstream culture in many respects, right? If we treat one as a microcosm of the other, are experiential, they are expressive, and they are ephemeral. That these capture important aspects of the nature of both spirituality, the spiritual turn, but also the wider culture in which it seems to thrive. So let me try and explain, right? I've already said that for those who are spiritual, right, what matters most is experience, right? We come to know truth through our feelings, our emotions, our intuitions, right? The reason I decided to go with the religion of the heart as a term is because I heard over and over again, right, in interviews, that the crucial thing you need to do is you need to follow your heart, right? That is a sacred kind of slogan for us. And in many respects, I agree. And I'll probably tell my kids that, right? So I don't think of it as in itself a bad thing. We should follow our heart, right? We should seek to be authentic to ourselves, right? But the problem is if that's all we do, right, we can end up following our heart into an enclosed, self-segregated space where we only spend time with people who agree with us, with people who make us feel comfortable, who affirm our feelings and intuitions, right? That is what happens if you go too far and you just only listen to follow your heart. Our culture, as we've seen, is expressive, right? We're interested in authenticity and self-realization, right? And on some level, because of that, we prize nonconformity, right? We raise up the artists who say F the system, right? We revere those people who go the opposite way from everyone else, the iconoclasts, right? They are the people we idolize. And, and at the same time, of course, because of this, we tend to see society and its institutions as sources of alienation. Things that are going to stifle us, right? Things that are going to force me to be something I'm not. Things that are going to constrain me, right? Now, I don't want to say that this is in itself or always a bad thing, right? Feminists in the 1960s needed to challenge the norms of patriarchy and sexism, right, in order to realize their true selves, right? Sometimes society is a source of alienation and oppression, right? But the problem I worry about is that increasingly in many people's minds, and I would say particularly young people's minds, right, there's this sort of zero-sum understanding of freedom and authenticity, and then community and society on the other, as though the more of one means the less of the other. You can only be free and authentic if you have a weak and corroding society and community, and you can only have a robust community and society if you have little freedom and little authenticity, right? I worry that that's become a taken for granted view, right? We pit these two against each other. And I fear that what's at the base of this is a kind of an ideal of radical freedom, right? That on some level we celebrate, right, the idea of just shedding our ties. I don't want anything to tie me down. I don't want anything to force me to do something I don't want to. I don't want anything to force me to have obligations, right? It's constraining. But of course, the flip side of that radical freedom is loneliness. I don't have anything tying me down, right? I have no obligations. I don't even know what to do, right? I have nothing to live for, right? And that is the danger, right? To shed all ties can be a liberating thing, but it can also be a profoundly alienating thing, right? And lastly, our modern culture, I think, is increasingly ephemeral, which is to say that it sees things that endure, traditions, rituals, organized community, as coercive and conformist. They stunt us as individuals, right? Why would I want to commit to this thing, right? I'm going to get stifled, or I'm going to get trapped, right? I think the perfect kind of embodiment of this is Burning Man, right, as an event, right? The ultimate kind of spiritual but not religious event, right? People gather in the desert, it's in Nevada, for a week, and they create these giant structures, take a lot of ecstasy, and then burn it all down, and then never see each other again, right? It's super intense. Super, super intense, right? Extremely emotionally thrilling, I think, right? But I think what it says is that there's a kind of restlessness, right? We don't want to be tied down. We're afraid of getting trapped. We're afraid of settling, right? That is what this pursuit of freedom of authenticity is often manifesting in us. And I want to say that the problem, right, everything as a trade-off, is that it's really difficult to create collective projects, right, that last where people are not willing to commit time, right? That nothing will endure if people aren't willing to give their time and energy. Okay. What do we do? I don't claim to have all the answers, and I look forward to hearing some of yours. But the way that I come at this is I think we need to start by rethinking the way that we think about the relationship between freedom and authenticity on one hand and community and society on the other. I think, and I see this particularly among young people, my students, I think that we have it wrong. I think we have the wrong view about this. We see things, again, in this zero-sum relationship, and that's a mistake. Right? It's a mistake empirically and it's a mistake philosophically. And so that's what I want to conclude on and try and make the case to you. So let's think about experience. Right? The thing about experience is, in my view, or I would argue, that it's actually those who lack community, those who are not rooted in a deep community, that are the most likely, right, to be manipulated by others. So that it's one thing to trust your experience, but if you are not rooted in a community, you are very likely to be manipulated by a kind of charlatan, because they're everywhere today, right? And so I would argue that community actually serves a very useful check on our experience, right? It doesn't mean we can't trust our intuitions and feelings, but it means that we have a place where we can go to be held accountable, right? To check those intuitions or those feelings that we have. That being rooted in community helps that, right? It doesn't stifle it. We have an expressive culture oriented to authenticity and self-realization, right? Now, I am not going to tell you not to pursue, authenticity. I will tell my kids this, and I do it myself, right? I think it's a really important thing. We should try and be our true selves. But I think that we have to give up the idea that we do that without other people. Right? That fundamentally, actually, right, it is only through the support and love of other people building us up that we can actually realize our potential. Right? And this is, for one, because who we are is actually a product of the people, the communities that raised us. Right? And those people, right, who are able to go out into the world with confidence are people who have an entire community right behind them, right? Who are supporting them, right? And so it's actually through community, in my view, that we realize our highest potential. And let's think about the ephemerality of our culture and how it prizes non-commitment, moving from one thing to the next, having endless choice, right? We do live in a world of more choice than ever. But in my view, it is the people who have a strong sense of the community who are able to navigate that endless choice wisely, right? Because you need to have a strong sense of who you are if you're going to be able to navigate this world of endless choice, right? If you don't know who you are, you're just going to get, passed along with every, changing trend. So it is being rooted in a community that allows you to navigate the world, right? And moreover, you don't accomplish anything worthwhile. This could be a marriage, a job, a woodworking project. You don't, anything worthwhile unless you actually commit to it, right? If you sit on the sideline, nothing valuable comes out, right? And this is true, obviously, of our institutions as well, right? That if we don't give our time, if we don't give ourselves, our institutions will decay, right? Simple as that. So 2 takeaways then. I have tried to suggest that it's a mistake, and this might be kind of provocative, but it's a mistake to think of authenticity and conformity as opposites. I want to make the argument that actually, on some level, you cannot have real authenticity without some kind of conformity. Which is to say, every genuine innovation, whether it's musical or academic, right, or athletic, is the result of individuals conforming to some existing tradition in a way that feels authentic, right? So I didn't just make up how to give a talk. I learned how to do it from the people before me. And I do it in a way that feels authentic to me, but I can guarantee you 99% of this is not authentic, or it's not original, right? We are not unique, right? We are learning from the people who come before us, and we basically live out them, their models that they set for us, right? And we forget that. We fool ourselves if we think otherwise, right? And lastly, as you can probably intuit, I think we need to realize that freedom and community and solidarity are also not at odds, that you need one to have the other. That on some profound level, right, our basic freedoms, the things that we want to be able to pursue authenticity, right, rely on a healthy community, rely on healthy institutions, right? We all feel the problems of an unhealthy community, an unhealthy set of institutions, right? We all suffer, right? And so we all have to feel the responsibility to build those institutions back up, to give of our time, right? To commit, because real freedom requires solidarity, right? It's not at odds with it. I've probably gone over my time, but that's it. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Galen. What a perfect way to kick off this series of talks on the theme of solidarity in a time of solitudes. We do have some time for questions. If you do have a question or a comment for Galen, I'd ask that you line up at one of the mics, either in the center or on the side of the room. That helps the people watching via live stream hear the question.
Thanks so much for this really interesting talk. I was fascinated with the theosophy and connecting it with these modern movements. It hadn't crossed my mind. I just read a biography of Louisa May Alcott.
Oh, really?
And just this wild religious movement they had, and connecting that with the charismatic movement today. It's just really making my mind spin. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah.
Fascinating and really interesting. I've been working in interfaith dialogue in this community for over 20 years now, and it's a wonderful place to be. And I hear so much of what you said. I want them all to have been here. Anyway, how would this talk go over in a crowd that was not drawn together because it's a lectures in Catholic experience? How would this talk go over in a, frankly, multi-faith place?
That's a great question. It's hard for me to say. I remember I gave a talk in 2018 at the World Parliament of Religions, which is, that would be in Toronto, that's right.
Missed you, too bad.
And I will say it went over pretty well. But
I'm delighted to hear that, and I expect it would. It was just like listening to all of this. I think one observation for me is I think the problem with the new, I've forgotten already, the religion of the heart is that it all too often becomes, and I am God.
Yeah, for sure. You're right.
It goes there.
It always has that danger.
Yeah.
I agree.
But the other question I have for you is, how much does capitalism and the need to keep on buying stuff contribute to this ephemeral, experiential, what was the third E?
Expressive
situation. I'm watching my granddaughter cruise the internet, and she can actually bake a cake with me now without narrating it as if she were on YouTube. I'm sorry. So that combination of everything present all the time in your face, but you have to buy more.
Yeah. Well, the capitalism question is a really big one, and what I'm describing is a very big movement. There are, of course, very consumeristic strands to it, as you've pointed out, but there are also much less consumeristic strands. I mean, the environmental movement is, of course, completely at odds with consumerism. I think that part of the nature of capitalism is that it's very good at co-opting whatever is out there, right? Whatever is. So that's why you have lots of Che Guevara, T-shirts. Like Che would be rolling in his grave, but you can make a buck. So on some level, right? What I'm trying to do is look past that on some level. Like what is genuine there? And I think there are genuine things. I don't think the romantic quest for authenticity, right, is a purely capitalist thing. I think,
I was asking how it exacerbates, especially the ephemeral piece.
Yes. Oh, yeah. No, you're totally right. I completely agree. And that is, I think it's a big hurdle. Like it's a very big hurdle. How do you overcome that when, and the infinite choice, right? And that sort of feeling of, well, maybe there's something better, right? I mean, that's what capitalism thrives on, right? Capitalism thrives on fantasy, right? It sells us fantasies, right? And so we buy things in pursuit of fantasy, and then marketers come up with new fantasies to sell us more stuff, right? So that's always a danger. David.
Yeah. Thank you for a very informative and engaging talk, Galen. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks,
and just as I was getting to the microphone, this woman has stolen my thunder about asking about the economy. But your answer so far addresses the culture that capitalism and consumerism promotes. I mean, it seems to me there's a deeper structural issue at play. I mean, most of us have 9 to 5 jobs, 40 hours a week, where we are living in a way that promotes individualism, promotes competition, promotes conformity. I mean, we have this experience. I mean, when I'm thinking of my own research on Quebec, and people were falling away from the Catholic Church so quickly in the Quiet Revolution, and people said, how could this possibly be? But they had decades of experience of working in Montreal and in Quebec City in these kind of jobs where you are working as an isolated individual away from your family, away from your community. And so the disintegration of connection that you're talking about, there's the cultural element that you've spoken to very well here, but there's also that structural element. I mean, how our lives are structured, how our institutions are structured. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that you're certainly onto something. I guess the question is, so there are kind of structural things about whatever we could call late capitalism that lead people to have to leave their homes or their hometowns, right, to go get a job. And that can be a very, so there's this push for economic mobility, which leads people to have to leave home. They can't raise their kids near their parents, and so grandparents aren't around, right? Many people feel this. These are very important issues that need to get addressed, right? So on some level, we can't address these without identifying material solutions, right? Allowing people to be able to live in the places that their parents and grandparents are. Not having to take, terrible wage jobs, right, just to survive, and, having support systems. So there is obviously a kind of profoundly material dimension to this, right? But I guess I'm not convinced. I do think that, so, in a place like Sweden, right, the Swedish are also having these issues, and they're concerned, right? So you need a strong support system. You need to help people be able to meet their basic needs, to be able to feed their families, and not have to live on the other side of the country just so you can get a job, right? We need to do this. We need to fix our economy to do that. But these forces of individualism are, in many respects, cultural, and they go deep in the way that we think about freedom, deep in the way that we think about maturity, right? We have this idea that to become an adult, you got to leave home, reject your parents, not see them, right? That's how you prove that you're an adult, right? That's a very strong story in our lives. It has an incredible impact, right? I mean, and people will do that even if materially they don't have to, right? They feel compelled, right? Because that's what you do to prove that you're an adult, that you've made it, right? So I think these things have a real force, The material thing has to get sorted, but it's not going to fix it. Please.
Thank you for sharing your fascinating research and analysis with us. I'm curious how you would characterize the eschatology of the religion of the heart, and does that give any insights into how sort of apocalyptic visions in pop culture are represented in these times compared to in more traditional religious?
Do you think, so I'd be curious, do you have any views about what the eschatology is?
I have no idea.
I'm not sure, I guess, so I'm sure there are, of course, eschatologies, right? Thinking about when the end times are coming. But in most of the people that I've studied, I don't see an eschatological vision. I'm sure though there are, right? I mean, there's a whole movement, growing scholarship on this thing called conspirituality, this sort of weird mix of conspiracy theories and spiritual stuff. And there's end of times rhetoric and ideas there. But I guess I do see that as a bit fringe. Maybe that's me. But I haven't given enough thought to what the eschatology, if there is a shared one,
and if
is.
There's a lack of that, would that somewhat explain the ephemeral element?
Yeah,
like if there's no
point.
sense of an end times, everything's just
I guess I'm not sure. I don't know if I'd want to answer in the affirmative. Okay. I'm not sure if you need an eschatology, but we're getting into theological questions. So but I appreciate the question.
Hi, Galen. Thank you for that. I very much enjoyed it. I'm going to pick up on a theme that has been raised already by David and previous questioners about, consumerism, etc. And it seems to me, and I know you know Peter Berger,
yep,
and the homeless mind,
of course,
and the idea with the rise of modernity, what we have is the pluralization of life worlds.
Yes,
and life worlds where the objective world is becoming less real,
and the subjective world becomes more real. Yeah, of course.
And yet, life worlds are only sustained by collectively.
Yeah.
They're never sustained by an individual.
Yeah.
So then this points to the deeper structure. So there's a deeper structure sustaining an idea that we can all be authentic individuals, etc. And one expression of that is consumerism. And we have consumer capitalism, which is we dress how we like, we choose what we want, and I agree with you in terms of it exploits fantasy. But that's part of authenticity. I have my own fantasy. So are there better and worse ways of being authentic?
Of course.
Ways that we can say that, as Charles Taylor said, where there's something more to the ephemeral than the wow moment.
Yeah,
and that's something, and that is potentially still there in the culture, but it needs to be developed because it's also exploited and turned in a different direction.
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, I will say, though, I do think that on some level, I have been trying to say that there is a better version of authenticity, right? That it has to be rooted in community. And to this, to go back to Peter Berger, to talk shop for just a moment, right? I mean, his argument in the heretical imperative is precisely this, right? That given the structural conditions of the modern world, we have to turn inwards. And he thinks that then you have to build, a theology on that basis, because that's just a structural feature of the modern world. So I'm saying that, yes, that is a structural feature, but we need to try and find better versions that are rooted in community, that don't say that, to be authentic, you need to have a great Instagram following, right, or buy the right things. I completely agree. And on some level, there's a great book about romantic movement, because the romantic movement at its core was a profoundly anti-consumeristic movement. Right? It was really committed to living in harmony with the natural world. But there's another book called The Romantic Ethic and the Spirit of Consumerism, which makes the case that it is romanticism fueling our consumeristic society. So yes, I mean, I don't want to throw away romanticism. I'm not willing to do that. I want to keep the value of authenticity, but I agree. It is mired in our commercial, capitalist machine. And I hope on some level we can try and pull out what's salvageable, right? But it's a big task, obviously. Thanks.
Thank you for your topic. It was wonderful today.
Thanks.
I think you're speaking to the choir here. I think everybody here understands that community is what supported us from the time that we were in arms until the time we're put to rest. And so it's a moment that perhaps we've mismanaged along the way. And I know in my case, I can speak about my children that don't, come to church, and they don't, do the rituals and things. Good hearts, great experiences. They love hockey. They love football, which are expressive, and they're very ephemeral, and they're the other E word.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So it's a situation where you can be free to do all those things, but they've lacked that historic knowledge and feeling that there's something that's holding them up. And so my concern is that as their generation comes up, what's holding that generation up? We see that, we're sort of importers of people that are holding us up. I don't see I don't know what the numbers are, but my perception is more people are coming to Canada than leaving Canada.
Are you talking about the Canadian, or are you talking about the church?
Canada.
Yeah, got it. I don't know about that.
You think more people are leaving Canada?
Sorry. Yeah, no, more people are coming. Yeah. I missed
so,
it. Yeah.
so there's something here that the
people
world wants to join.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of that is that freedom, that multicultural atmosphere.
Yeah.
And but I think we're going to lose that underpinning of community.
Yeah. Well, now you're preaching to the choir. I mean, I mean, obviously, I'm of a younger generation, but I worry about this, of course. But I will say that I am not making the argument that everyone needs, all the young people need to go back to church. I explicitly don't make that argument because I don't think that's going to work. Just telling people that they, moralizing to them. But also, it's more about changing how people think of, just commit to something. Be grounded in some community. It doesn't have to be religious. I mean, I don't care. I'm not a priest, So, but I worry about all of us, right? Because if we're not willing to commit to stuff, and I understand I'm totally preaching to the choir. Like I'm sure, but I have no one else to preach to. So.
Hi there. So I was just wondering, I love the connection you made between the breakdown of community and institutions and how that can make people more vulnerable to being manipulated by charlatans who usually have economic aims, right? I was curious to know what your thoughts are on the acceleration of that breakdown during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I was wondering, I still think we're recovering. In some ways, it's like we're still recovering from that as a community. I'm wondering, because I'm an educator and I have a lot of students who I'm wondering, how can I help rehabilitate their idea of community, or in some cases, they were in their formative years and they might have never experienced community like we did when we were young people. So I'm wondering, what as a society, as leaders or future leaders in a community, can we do to, as a solution?
I wish I had a 5-point plan that you could follow. I don't. I agree with you entirely that the pandemic, it made a bad situation much, much worse. And I see this in my students, right? I see this feeling of disconnection. I guess, the one thing that gives me hope is that I sense that among young people there is a kind of desire for more. This is maybe my optimism and blinding me, but I do think that there is something about the human spirit that, senses when things are not right and then sort of seeks out answers. And so I guess be there for people who are looking for answers. Don't let the charlatans get to them, right? Be the example that, that somebody looks to, and be that role model, and then, put out a hand. On some level, I think that's the only way it can happen. It's not going to happen from people like standing on a podium, giving a big speech. It's just going to be from people going to coffee and hanging out and doing things on the weekend, right? Just that kind of day-to-day interaction. That's where it's really happening. Thanks.
Oh, hello, Dr. Watts. Thank you for your talk. I'm, thinking about everyone's questions so far. My question is, are there parallels of this religion of the heart becoming so dominant or widespread in past history? I'm thinking of, the loss of institutional religions of the Roman Empire, and how Christianity swept in and honestly fixed everything.
I guess it depends on how you think about the Roman Empire. Well, there are interesting analogies, right, between our moment and antiquity, right? I'm sure some religious studies scholars thought about this, right? An age of kind of warring gods, as it were. And there is something, in a way, we tend, certainly in the West and as descendants of Christian cultures, we tend to think about the period from like 1200 to let's say 1950, when the Christian church was dominant, was structuring the entire society in Europe, right, and then later in North America, as the norm. But you could flip it around, right? Maybe that was abnormal, right? Which is to say, maybe that was quite strange to have this kind of, as Peter Berger would call this, sacred canopy, right? And what if the norm is to have much more kind of diversity and buzzing and less? That's just another way of thinking about the situation, right? I don't see us going back to that period of a kind of overarching sacred canopy. I think we have to make do with a pluralistic, diverse world, right? And nothing is going to be perfect. Maybe one of the other things I want to say to David and others who raised the point about, we're never going to have a perfect world, right? These are trade-offs. There are things, on some level, I think that, to be authentic and individual and free, we do need to have community. But community can also be stifling, right? So these are things we have to live with. We have to hold these things in tension. And on some level, I'm asking us to sort of reorient our balance between these things, right? And it's a hard truth, but that's what we need to do.
Thank you.
Please bear with me. So I say you join community only if you know your heart, because your heart will bring you to the oneness. I can be free only if I know myself. This is what we, our lives are the lives of illusion because we don't know our hearts. That's all.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Galen. You've helped us understand where we've come from, how we got here, what our potential is, what the possibilities are. I wonder if you would even dare to stretch a little further in terms of ultimacy. And I have a 4-part question which relates to that, and you can respond as briefly, as pithily as you want to.
Okay.
You started off very early mentioning an image of all of us climbing up the same mountain, wherever we happen to be coming from according to our ideologies or whatever, towards the summit. Do you still think that's kind of fair to use that image?
Well, that's definitely the image I used. I mean, in a way, I was trying to capture, on some level, what's at the heart of theosophy as a movement. But if we're getting into theological territory here, sure, yeah, I'll follow you. Let's go.
Okay, second part. Realistically, can we or will we all get there to the summit?
Oh, interesting. Oh my gosh. Well, I mean, maybe my response would, slightly pithy, would be that, what matters is the journey, not the destination, right?
Okay, fair enough. The journey, how long? I was going to ask you, how long do you suppose it will take for us to get there if we all are heading to...
But now you're getting into the eschatology thing, right?
Yes.
I mean, I do think the point is pursuing it, right? I mean, what's truth, but you may never get there. And I don't think that's a failure.
But if you're going to use that image, is there a summit or is it just the pathway?
Sure, there is a summit, if what we mean by that is spiritual religious truth, for sure, right?
And would you dare to speculate on what the summit might be? Might it be self-actualization, or might it be oneness with God, or...
That is above my pay grade. in a way, like, I guess my view is that we all need to figure that out ourselves. That is, and I can't answer that question. I don't want to answer that question. I mean, I'm trying to figure that answer out for myself, but I don't want to tell other people what they should think, because that's not, I want to figure that out for myself, but I don't want to tell people what the summit looks like.
Well, I'd love to hear what other people think, so if anybody wants to. I'm listening. Thank you.
Reading group, thanks very much.
Thank you. I just want to start by saying that you've created a really wonderful theory and presentation about how community in physical spaces is declining. I was wondering if you'd care to comment about how the young generation is creating community spaces online, and about how, even though we're not necessarily all sitting in the same church or the same youth group or physical club in the real world, we are moving those spaces onto online. And do you feel that that's diminishing the connections that we're making?
Okay, so this is the classic Sarah response. All right, so here I have to say I am convinced by the work of Jonathan Haidt, the author of The Anxious Generation. It recently came out. And I mean, really, what he's arguing is that there is a fundamental difference between being together in person, physically, and being together online.
Sorry, do you also feel that that includes things like Zoom videos where we're able to see each other face to face?
Yeah, no, yeah. So online, I would put that in the virtual community. It's not that I think it's worthless by any means. It's better than not, but it isn't the same. And part of this has to do with the kinds of creatures that we are. We evolved in very small bands together, right? We are the kind of being right, that needs close physical touch. A baby needs to be touched. Baby needs to be held, right? It's not enough to hold an iPad up to a baby's face, right? It needs it. And we need it too, whether we realize it or not, right? We have evolved like that. It's profoundly in our DNA. And so that's why it feels different to be with somebody in a room, right? And to hold somebody, right? It's just not the same. You know, my parents, you know, Zoom our kids. It's just not the same. Having, you know, the grandparents there, you know, with the kids on their lap, it is a fundamentally different experience. Again, I'm not trying to say that it's not worthwhile. There's value in it, of course. And some people can't be there physically present, right? If you're handicapped or disabled, but fundamentally, it isn't the same. Right?
Thank you.
Thank you, Galen, for your talk, and for talk, ostensibly about situating spirituality within the Catholic tradition. And I was kind of surprised you never mentioned kind of historically the medieval German theologian and mystic Meister Eckhart.
Meister Eckhart, yeah.
Who was considered like a heretic in his time, but he's become popular in recent decades.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, and that is part of the history of spirituality and personal the turn in Catholic tradition, which I would have maybe I thought that be mentioned in that and talk about.
It would have made sense. I agree. But I'm not an expert in Catholicism. I of course know about Meister Eckhart, and you're right. I mean, I could have put him in as an important tributary in that tradition, because you're right. But yeah, I appreciate that. You're right. The Catholic tradition has its own versions of the religion of the heart, for sure.
I wanted to comment about the second last comment about online and in person, and about not being the same. And it seems to me that there are so many not the sames. I grew up as an army brat, and so I lived in a lot of places. I didn't have one hometown. I still don't. And that when I got to be an adult, I did basically settle down in one community and then in another. And then I found that there were a lot of not the sames. There was my neighborhood where I knew very few people. There was my university where I did another degree. That was my second university, and where I got to know a small number of people sort of well until we all separated, and so forth. And then there was the congregation that I joined and was in for quite a long time. It didn't really feel 100% connected with people because they had their families and so forth. My family was remote.
Right.
We didn't have remote, we just had long distances. And
writing letters.
yeah, but that was very hard for me. I didn't feel connected. And so that I'm just thinking of how many people there must be like me who have lacked connection in many ways, and who would have been grateful at many stages to feel as connected as some people feel online. So I'm just full of that no right answer here, but many possible answers.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that I certainly don't want to downplay the value that exists in virtual community. But I guess I don't think it's all relative. Just like I don't think virtual education is the same as in-person education, right? If you have no choice, because there's a pandemic, fine, put the kids on a virtual screen. But in normal time, don't do that, because they're not going to learn the same. They're not going to get as much from it. So I guess I would say the same thing in general about community. There are exceptions, of course, but I do think that we have to recognize that. I don't think virtual communities can replace flesh and blood communities.
I'd like to just add that I think I'm coming from the same place, that all of those not quite making it
right.
is not what I would call ideal.
Oh, I see. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Sorry. I misunderstood your question then. Sorry. Thank you.
Quick one?
Oh, hello again. My question was, are there any versions of the religion of the heart that you see in other parts of the world today?
Yeah, well, I mean, so for just one example, the rise of Sufism. Right? Sufism has become extremely popular in parts of the Middle East, right? So, that is one among many other I could name. There's a guy named François Gauthier who has a great book on this. He actually looks at China, he looks at, the Middle East, Africa, and kind of does this work really well.
Okay.
Thanks.
I'm Peter Meehan, president of St. Jerome's University. Please join me in thanking Galen Watts for his very engaging talk. Before we conclude for the evening, I'd like to offer a few thank yous and a few reminders. First of all, thanks to all of you for being with us here to help live out St. Jerome's mission to be a place where thoughtful people think hopefully about the major issues facing the church and the world. Thank you to Jamie Phillip and Courtney Winhold in Marketing and Communications for the work promoting and organizing this evening's event. Thank you, as always, to our friend Norm Clare at the Unmarketing Group for recording and live streaming. Thanks to our facilities team who set up this space. Thanks to our campus ministry people for allowing us to use this space. And thanks to our partners at Dana Hospitality for tonight's beverages and snacks. We encourage you to continue to enjoy these out in the corridor after the talk. And finally, please join us for our next lecture in Catholic Experience on November 14th, when Professor Matt Hoven, Associate Professor at St. Joseph's College at the University of Alberta, will be speaking to us on the topic of Father David Bauer. The talk is called In a Small Way, Hockey Can Improve the World. Father David Bauer's vision for Canada's game. We hope you can be with us. Thanks so much.